that she's really disappointed you, and you don't want to have a relationship with him anymore. Am I understanding you correctly? And when she says, yes, Mum, that's right, the listener will be surprised and say, yes, that's exactly what I feel. So that's the first part.
And this issue of feelings is crucial, isn't it? That you are reflecting back their feelings and responsive and asking about their
Yeah.
feelings?
Yeah, no, that is a really important part, Lynn, about listening, is that to realize that all humans are actually governed by their feelings. And it's very important for some of my listeners to realize that maybe in their family culture or their workplace or their even gendered sort of environment, feelings can be forbidden or taboo, or they frighten the listener. And so some people, I'm not saying many, but some people shut feelings down. So when the child is angry or outraged or impatient about what they're talking about, that's taboo. So you shut it down, thinking that is sort of a bad thing. But the realization that actually feelings they are very, very important, that a child is allowed to have those feelings and to express them. So you say, so how do you feel about that? How do you feel that you and Amelia have a falling out? Sometimes children will say, oh, nothing, and that shows that the family culture hasn't encouraged this. But you say, well, nothing. Are you a little, and you can take a stab at it. Are you a little bit angry about it? Angry, she says, and she goes on and saying she's furious, etc. And again, as a parent, you will react. You think, oh God, she's really angry, and I don't really want her, because Amelia's mum is my best friend. So you become anxious, and you say, well, you shouldn't feel like that. That's not the way to go. You say, so you are feeling really angry, and that validates her, and also it helps her to realize she is angry. She might say, well, actually, I'm more disappointed than angry. Often the listener will correct you and say, no, I'm not angry or disappointed. I'm just, and so she unpacks her own nuanced feelings life. You understand her better, and she understands herself better. And so you are well on the way of enabling the child to move forward. So, yes. And so, again, you can summarize your feelings. You can say, well, so obviously you and Amelia had a bad falling out, and you're disappointed about it, and you're a bit angry. Uh, and your child will be so surprised. She'll be so happy. She says, yes, Mum. And she'll be sitting there thinking, it's so good to be heard.
Text in saying, great advice from this interviewee. So often as a teacher, I heard kids say that their parent just didn't listen to them and let them work things out without immediately jumping in with judgments and advice on what the child should do. And that comes to your next issue, I think, here, Joseph, which is rather than offering solutions, asking the child what options they see as
Yeah,
possible solutions.
yeah. That's right, Lynn. That's exactly what the parent should do. It's important for us to realize why a parent does that. It is not because they're bad people. It's because their emotions are activated, their own anxiety and they can see, they're more mature, they can see the outcome, what should happen, and they just say, well, here it is, do it. And that's normal, logical, but it is not a very skillful process. It's much better to ask that person to go to discover that themselves. You can see that solution X is the best solution, but you can't impose that. It's much better that they go on a little journey and discover that themselves. Then they have buy-in. So, as you say, Lynn, if you ask the person, your child, so where are you going to go next with Amelia? Well, what are some of your options about this? You'll be surprised how intelligent your child is. And she said, well, I was thinking of writing her a note or writing her a letter and saying I don't want to have anything to do with her. And then the child might say, but I'm not sure whether that's really good, and so I'm not quite sure what to do. And so you can, instead of jumping in, you keep on saying, well, is there any other way you could do it? And then if that doesn't work, a really good way to do it is to say to the child, so, okay, so what advice would you give yourself? Now, that's a very powerful question. When you ask a child, what advice would you give yourself? You enable them to look at themselves in a slightly more detached way, to see themselves in their dilemma, and to actually see their own wisdom. They discover their own wisdom. And so she might all of a sudden say, well, I think the best thing I can do is to just stay friends with her and her friendship group, but realize that there are issues there and I just keep away from it emotionally. I just become a little bit more kind of detached from the group, but I will keep the peace. And you think, wow, that's great. That is really good. She discovered this herself because you ask, what are your options and what advice would you give yourself? So that is a really, really a really great thing to do.
We've just got a couple of minutes, Joseph, but I
Yeah,
thought we might reflect on the fact that this reflective listening technique can be applied to other areas. So while we're talking about a parent or guardian or caregiver's relationship with a child, these are also skills that you can apply to your partners, your parents, perhaps your friends, even your workmates.
absolutely. These skills are just vital for the workplace. Like maybe I'm politically incorrect, but no, I won't say this. But what I'm with your partner, it's vital. Like if you can do this to your partner and they feel heard and they explore their own options, then you build up a huge amount of trust with them and an empathy and understanding, and then you can truly collaborate. If you really understand how they really feel, and you listen to that, then you can collaborate. So you can do it at work as well. It's very powerful. The most effective bosses, the most effective managers have these skills, and they just allow their employees to talk and explain what they are. But there's one more thing, because we've got to finish, don't we, Lynn, soon? And there's one more thing I didn't give you in your notes, but I just want to add before we finish. Is at the end of the conversation, often the parent does want some input, and often the child actually really values it, and so you're not entirely a silent bystander, but because you've listened well, they are very receptive. And so what you can do then, you can say, well, you know, do you know what I think? And they say, well, what is that, mum? Because they feel you've listened, and you think, I would always then, I advise the parents to reaffirm and reiterate what the child has come to. You might not think it's perfect, but it's a long way to the right direction. So you might say, well, I think you are really quite wise in doing this. And never try and make, and then you might add something to you. You say, an enemy once made is an enemy forever. And so it's better to play your cards a little bit calmly, like you're suggesting, and keep things cool, and maybe bridges can be mended later. So you do add your advice, but you do it in such a way that you affirm the child. And then the last part I suggest in families is that a hug and an affirmation and just a big kiss and a hug of your child and say, I'm really proud of you. You're just a wonderful child. That is usually a wonderful way to finish. And that's how we do it as adults with our friends.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Joseph Dreesen, education consultant and parenting coach. It's 16 minutes to 12. Any moment now we'll be crossing to the Beehive, where the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, will be addressing the media about the resignation of the Health Minister, David Clark, from his portfolio. But I'll share with you some of the responses to Joseph's talk. Penny said, look, with reflective listening, be careful not to parrot child's words like a robot. It's so obvious after a while and so annoying. Get the gist of what they say and reflect this. Another listener says, excellent advice about supporting children to unpack their emotional nuances around significant events. And they'd like us to post the audio of that interview. Now, just to say that we do that. In fact, there's a parenting slot from 9 to noon that has a regular podcast page too. So you can go to the 9 to noon webpage, rnz.co.nz/9 to noon, and there'll be a link to that interview very soon. Another texter says, I wonder if we might contract Joseph to lecture to some radio journalists. There are some who listen only with their tongue, only waiting to insert their opinion. Thank you for that. And another listener,
Kia ora koutou katoa and good morning. Yesterday I received Dr. David Clark's resignation as Health Minister, which I accepted. Last week I had discussions with Dr. Clark. We talked about how important the COVID response was and the need for that to be our primary focus as a government, as a cabinet and as ministers. He reached the conclusion his ongoing presence in the health role was causing too much distraction to the government's ongoing response to COVID-19, an assessment I agree with. David has put the interests of the team ahead of his own. I want to thank him for his service. He delivered a lot in his 3 years as Health Minister and many things that he can be very proud of. This is a complex pandemic that is growing in the rest of the world, so the challenge of responding to it is going to be with us for some time, and we cannot afford any diversions from our objectives. I am appointing Chris Hipkins as the new Health Minister, but will be reassessing after the election. To be clear, David Clark will not be reappointed as Health Minister next term. We are both now happy to take questions.
Minister, in those discussions that you had with David Clark last week, did you in any way insinuate or suggest to him that you wanted him to offer his resignation?
It was a very open conversation, and the discussion we had was the fact that for both of us, the focus has always been the government's response to COVID-19. That has to come first. And what has become clear to both the Minister, an assessment I agree with, that unfortunately his role was continuing to be a distraction to our response, and that just wasn't something that we could have continue. Again, my focus has been COVID all the way through, our response to COVID. In those early days, continuity was the most important thing. In my view, we couldn't afford to lose one of our key players in our COVID response at that time. But given COVID is our number one focus, we now can't afford to have any distraction from that either.
How much was it? Did he have an open mind that he may be able to stay on as the Health Minister?
No, the conversations that I had with Dr. Clark always demonstrated to me that he had a very open and frank assessment of what was happening at this time. He is someone who puts the team first, who puts New Zealand first, and he came to the conclusion that his ongoing role as Health Minister was acting as a distraction to our COVID response. He put that response first.
How much was
Jessica?
a few weeks ago.
Jessica?
Why didn't he just resign a few weeks ago then when we got to those 0 cases, when effectively getting us through the pandemic was done?
Well, it's not done. COVID-19 will be with us for a long time to come. Our response will need to continue for a long time to come. The view that the Minister reached was that his presence in the role was becoming a distraction to what will need to be an ongoing response. Derek?
Basically because, how much of a factor was the public outcry over the video that went viral when Dr. Bloomfield was
Look, regardless, anything that acts as a distraction, anything that takes away our time, effort and energy from our response to COVID-19, we just as a country can't afford. So that was a very frank conversation the Minister and I openly had last week. He then came to the very firm view that his ongoing role in this portfolio was going to get in the way of that response.
Do you consider though that because that was quite a large, that in particular was distracting from what was going on in the managed isolation and quarantine facilities, was that increasingly making him become a diversion?
Again, as I say, it's been an assessment that we've been taking from last week. We need, as a country, as a government, as a cabinet, to be totally focused on our pandemic response. And anything, regardless of the origin, anything that acts as an unnecessary distraction to that, we just simply couldn't afford, and the Minister recognised that. Yeah, Jackson.
Prime Minister, since David Clark broke the lockdown by taking his family to the beach, has he ever not been a distraction?
Oh, again, I would really just push back on that. The Minister himself has recognised that the COVID response does need to be our priority, and that obviously continuity in the level 4 time, when we were in really the height of the pandemic, continuity was important. We've come out of that phase. We have an ongoing response that we need really clear leadership and direction on, and his view was he couldn't continue to do that. So he's taken that call. That doesn't, I think, take away from the wider work that he has done as a minister. Mental health in particular will be a real legacy of Dr. David Clark.
Is it not an easy way out for you, though, as PM, to have that conversation with him, make it very clear that you think he's been a distraction, and then just leave it up to him to resign?
Sorry, is it?
Is it an easy way out for you to avoid having to sack him, because you obviously made your views pretty clear? But
No, not at all. You know, my view is that when someone absolutely needs to go from the role, that's the conversation I have with them. In this case, we had a discussion around what we needed to do to make sure COVID was a priority, what we needed to do to make sure there weren't distractions. David was the one that ultimately came away after thinking through some of what he had experienced in the past weeks, going through some period of time, that ultimately was his view, and it was his view, that he needed to go.
if you hadn't come to that conclusion, though, would you have allowed him to stay?
Oh, look, I actually, in the end, there's no need for that hypothetical. As you would expect, I do have conversations with my team during periods like this, and it happens to be that whilst Minister Clark made this decision, it is one I agree with.
In the front there. Distraction did the Labour Party think that Minister Clark was for the party leading up to the election?
Again, look, regardless, this ultimately was a decision for Dr. Clark. You know, I'm sure that he, of course, has conversations with colleagues and others and so on, but ultimately it was his call and his judgment.
Prime Minister, the last couple of days you've been at pains to point out that the pandemic is getting worse around the world.
Yep.
During level 4, you wouldn't accept Dr. Clark's resignation. Given the global situation, why was it appropriate to do so today?
It always matters where our relative situation is as a country as well, Luke. And obviously at that time we were in the middle of a lockdown. We were at the height of our response. But COVID, whilst we are in a position at the moment where COVID has been kept at our borders through quarantine and isolation measures, this is not a pandemic that is going away. It does need to remain as our number one priority, and we still cannot have distractions from that. So that's a view I share with the Minister.
Given
Ben.
you've given the job to the Education Minister, combining two massive portfolios that haven't been combined, I understand, for the best part of a century, doesn't that just show the reason you've not sacked David Clark and not accepted his resignation earlier? Because you have no one to give it to.
No.
Prime Minister.
Sorry,
Minister, did you raise with David Clark in those discussions last week, did you raise with him that he was a distraction?
we had a general conversation around what was needed to put the country first and our COVID response first. And ultimately, the Minister has taken the decision that him remaining in this role means that we are not best placed to do that. He has put the team first. He's put New Zealand first.
Yeah,
Thomas.
What day was that conversation on, and where did it take place? Was it a phone call or in the office? Or?
In person, late last week.
Right, on Friday you told us that it was your intention that David Clark would stay on as Health Minister until September the 19th. So can you just lay out with a bit more certainty the time frame, how those discussions played out, and whether you had insinuated to the then Minister that he should go?
As you can imagine, in employment situations, just like any workplace, when a minister and a portfolio and a subject area is as important as this one, I will have ongoing conversations with ministers. I don't think that will be of any surprise to you. Last week, I had a discussion with the Minister around some of issues that were getting in the way of our ability to really focus in on COVID-19. And the Minister came to the conclusion yesterday that, in his view, that meant he could no longer continue in the role. We'll start taking the last few questions. Jane.
But were you still publicly backing him while you were having conversations where you were obviously, giving strong signals about his future?
Yeah, as I say, no conclusion had been reached, and it's not unusual that I would have conversations with ministers around something as important as our COVID response.
Was this the first time that he offered his resignation since the beach excursion?
Yes.
Are you open to
Yep.
Clark taking up a different ministerial role next term? Is the door open and that outside of health?
Post-election, yes. It will not be a health role, but I have not closed that door. Again, as I say, I do think that Minister Clark has made a significant contribution to Cabinet. I've made no decisions about any future ministerial portfolios, no decisions around any future makeup of a Cabinet. That would all be premature. But, yes, I would leave that door open. Jessica. Minister Hipkins is available if anyone chooses.
Okay, well, maybe this is to you and to him, but how will you make it work? How do you have an education portfolio and a health portfolio?
Yeah. Keep in mind, this is a decision that I've made for this period, and then I will reassess at the election, because I absolutely have at the front of my mind the importance of both portfolios currently being held by Minister Hipkins. Second point to make is the reason I have chosen Minister Hipkins is in part because of the experience that he has with an operational ministry of significant scale, but also his role in state services. Our COVID response is an all-of-government response, making sure that you have a good understanding and awareness of how to draw in the public sector as effectively as possible is one of the strengths that Minister Hipkins has, and one of the things we need to bring to our COVID recovery and response.
Preferable for you, Prime Minister, for David Clark to resign rather than you sack him? Why was that preferable?
Again, that's making it sound as though that was something sat down and worked through as a choice. I had a conversation with Dr. Clark, as I would with any of my Cabinet colleagues, when we have something as significant as a COVID response to work through as a team. We talked frankly about his current position. He, after giving it thought, came to the conclusion in his mind that he needed to stand down in order to put the COVID response first.
You laid out all the dots and you kind of left him to
No,
join
not
them,
necessarily.
not for a resignation.
Look, again, I ask you just to think of this in the same way you would any employment relationship you have, because that is how I deal with the people I work with. Often these are open conversations, and in this scenario, you'd imagine that I frequently talk to David Clark, and have been for many, many months, about our COVID response and recovery. This is no different.
Mr. Hipkins,
Yeah, just in the front, Minister
Mr.
Hipkins.
Hipkins, what's the first thing you're planning to do in his portfolio?
Well, obviously, our response to COVID-19 is a really big focus for the health portfolio at the moment, so I'll be sitting down with the health team, working through all of the health-related aspects to that. And then we've got a number of other pressing challenges in the portfolio. We've had Heather Simpson's review, and the report has been presented to government, so we need to work our way through the government's response to that. There's some big capital investments being undertaken in the health portfolio, and similarly to in education, where we're doing big capital investments. I know that they require constant supervision and nurturing to make sure that they are happening. There are other areas. David Clark has been doing a lot of work in mental health. I think he's done some outstanding work in mental health, and I want to make sure we don't lose any momentum in that area. So,
Will you be helping designing health policy for the election?
well, of course, there is the Heather Simpson review. We need to consider that as a team, and yes, I'll be involved in that process. I was already involved in that process as Minister of State Services, and I'll continue to be involved in that.
Of the Labor Health Manifesto, there's going to be nothing more consumer focused.
Well, look, we're not going to announce the Labor Party Health Manifesto here today.
Relationship with Dr. Ashley Bloomfield already, and what's it like?
Yes, during the lockdown period, I did have a good working relationship with Dr. Bloomfield. I haven't been able to talk to him this morning. We've been playing phone tag, but I'm sure we will speak very shortly. I expect that I have a very good working relationship with him. I regard him as an exemplary public servant.
When does that mean he doesn't get his week off next week as he wants?
No, look, I think Ashley Bloomfield has thoroughly earned a holiday. I think all New Zealanders would believe that he's earned a holiday. I hope that he will still take that.
The Prime Minister.
Do you have any experience at all in a health portfolio? Have you ever had anything to do with?
Look, as I said, I think, as the Prime Minister has said, actually, I have an experience working in a big operational portfolio that has a lot of complexity. I didn't have any experience working in the education portfolio when I became the Minister of Education.
Over obviously, a big portfolio with your existing workload. I mean, is it fair to say it's really a caretaker position rather than you know, a normal ministerial role?
Look, I will be giving it my all up until the election. What happens beyond that, of course, is a question for the Prime Minister, and she's indicated she's not going to speculate on that before the election, and I would not expect her to.
Portfolio you've eyed in the past, is it something that you might have wanted to go on to instead of education?
Oh, look, I like a good challenge.
Very few in government on health. All right, we'll just look at last couple of questions. I'll finish with, I'll take Tova and Jackson.
Prime Minister, how much of a factor in David Clark's resignation was the public backlash against him?
Oh, look, again, as I've said, regardless of the origin, ultimately, if there is any distraction to our COVID response, we just can't have that. That's something that Dr. Clark himself has recognised. We have to put that COVID response and recovery first. Jackson?
If David Clark hadn't offered his resignation this week, what course of action would you have taken?
No need for that hypothetical. He came to that decision, and I think
He didn't offer his resignation?
and I think it was the right one. Okay, thanks everyone.